People living in remote areas, what's the strangest thing that's happened to you? I grew up in the dead center of the deep woods in Louisiana. Our closest neighbor was literally 20 miles away. Our house sat right on top of a lonely hill, and down at the bottom was a dark creek that cut through the dense trees for miles and miles. My grandfather used to sit on the porch and warn us about the woods. He always insisted they were deeply disturbed, isolated folks living completely off the grid out there, like some real-life horror movie scenario. I never believed him. I just assumed he was trying to creep us out to keep us from wandering off after dark. One night, when I was only 8 years old, I was sitting alone in the living room watching a movie on the television. The house was dead quiet except for the sound of the screen. Suddenly, my father walked fast into the living room. His face was completely pale. He looked at me and told me in a sharp whisper not to move an inch. He explained that on his way to the bathroom, he distinctly heard heavy footsteps inside, followed by the back door slamming shut. He was convinced someone had sneaked into the house, and that he accidentally scared them off when he walked down the hallway. To make sure the perimeter was clear, my father stepped outside into the dark, leaving the front door wide open. That absolutely terrified me. I paused the movie. I sat completely frozen in the rocking chair, just listening to the heavy silence of the woods for a couple of minutes. That is when the cold truth hit me. The intruder was still inside. As I stared out of the living room doorway into the dark corridor, I saw the top of a head slowly peek around the corner. It was a person, but they had a rough white sheet pulled completely over their head, crudely cut and tied tightly around the neck like a makeshift mask. I was completely paralyzed. Even if my brain screamed at me to run, the only exit was right toward this deeply unsettling individual. He just stood there in the shadows, staring at me through the eye holes for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he turned around and moved toward the rear of the house. A second later, the back door slammed shut again. I broke down and just sat there crying in pure panic until my father finally rushed back inside. My dad told me that as he rounded the outside corner to the back of the house, he actually caught the guy stepping out of the door. The intruder spotted my dad and immediately booked it down the steep hill toward the dark creek. Suddenly, a loud gunshot echoed through the trees. It turns out my grandfather had been sitting on his own porch next door. He had spotted the strange figure creeping toward our house earlier, grabbed his weapon, and got outside just in time to see the guy sprinting down the hill. He took a shot and managed to hit the intruder in the leg. The guy stumbled violently, fell into the dirt, but somehow scrambled back up before my grandfather could take another shot. He disappeared completely into the thick brush. By the time the law enforcement units finally arrived out there, the man was long gone. They conducted a massive search through the brush, but could not track him down in the dark. However, they did find something deeply bizarre about a mile into the thick woods. It was a completely run-down, rotting wooden shack. When the deputies stepped inside, they found absolutely nothing but dozens of old pots and pans covering the floor. It was incredibly strange and unsettling. Cultural note: the bayous and dense pine forests of rural Louisiana contain some of the most geographically isolated communities in the United States. Due to the extreme terrain and vast distances between properties, local law enforcement response times in these rural parishes can frequently exceed 45 minutes to an hour. This extreme isolation forces families to rely entirely on self-defense and multi-generational family plots for security against trespassers or vagrants living illegally within the surrounding wilderness. I live on quite a big piece of land in Australia, right at the very edge of the dense bush. One night, my family and I had all of our living room blinds completely open. Our television is mounted on a wall directly between two massive glass windows. If you look outside past the glass, you will see a heap of empty paddocks stretching out before hitting a solid wall of trees. My dad usually parks his work vehicle about 10 meters away from that window. As we were all sitting there watching a show, my mom suddenly starts yelling and asking if we just saw that. My dad and I were completely confused, but she quickly explains that some massive winged creature just tried to land right on top of my dad's car. Sure enough, when we looked out, the metal aerial on his car was going freaking nuts, bending back and forth. Besides that aggressive movement, there was absolutely nothing else outside in the dark. I am pretty sure it was a wedge-tailed eagle, but needless to say, no one went outside into the dark to check. We shut those blinds pretty quickly. On another occasion, my brother was given a pretty decent white drone. He was playing with it quite close to the house, but he accidentally flew it too high, and a sudden gust of wind caught it. The device went straight up and out of sight in seconds, drifting way over the wall of trees and in the general direction of our neighbor's house. He came inside completely hysterical. He was crying so hard that naturally we thought he had been bitten by a venomous snake or something. He finally told us what happened, but we could not really go looking for it right away. Mom was working at the far end of our land, and Dad was inside mid-process changing the water in his massive fish tank. Leaving that task unfinished would cost us thousands of dollars in exotic fish and corals. My brother was too young to go searching the bush alone, and I was frankly too much of a scaredy cat to leave our property line. About 10 minutes after this happened, our neighbor comes driving along our fence line in her utility vehicle. She stops and asks if we saw something white flying around, because apparently her girlfriend was completely freaked out thinking it was a flying saucer or something. I told her the truth about the drone, and she kindly offered to drive me to the paddock behind her land to look for it. We got to the old barbed wire fence separating her land from this empty, dead, flat, massive paddock. To the left, there was an even bigger, darker wall of trees. We climb over the wire and start walking through the long, dry grass looking for this bloody drone. I had already given up all hope of finding it, when my neighbor suddenly points into the distance. The drone was sitting almost halfway through the paddock, in a specific spot where the grass was a bit shorter, making it easier to see. She stops about 15 meters away while I walk over alone to retrieve it. The moment I bend down to grab the plastic frame, my neighbor just screams, "Holy shit!" I look up, and this massive wedge-tailed eagle swoops down directly next to me. Its wingspan had to be at least 7 feet wide. It cast a huge shadow over the dirt. My neighbor had already turned around and started running back to her vehicle in pure panic. I screamed at the top of my lungs and ran right after her. The giant bird circled low over the trees and finally disappeared into the brush. I am pretty sure it was swooping down to grab the drone right when I went over, because the device was bright white and about the exact same size of a small lamb, which is what they usually target out here. It was so completely peaceful in that field, and suddenly this massive predator was nearly on top of me. These are easily two of the creepiest things that have happened to me out where I live. I do feel quite lucky though, because I read somewhere that those birds are incredibly rare now. Also, possums screaming in the middle of the night out here is very unsettling, especially when your brain does not register that it is just an animal at first. Cultural note: the wedge-tailed eagle is Australia's largest bird of prey, featuring a massive wingspan that can exceed 2.5 meters. In the isolated regions bordering the Australian bush, these apex predators are highly territorial and known for their aggressive aerial hunting tactics. They possess exceptional eyesight and frequently attack small livestock, native wildlife, and increasingly remote-controlled drones, which they perceive either as rival intruders or as potential prey due to their size and movement patterns. When I lived way out in the middle of nowhere in Australia, the setting was incredibly lonely. There was nothing but endless red desert stretching out in every direction, and our nearest neighbors were located at least 10 kilometers away. Our property sat right at the dead end of a long, dusty dirt road. Since there were absolutely no other houses along that path, nobody ever drove down there unless they were making a specific trip to visit us. It was pure isolation. One night, I was relaxing and taking a warm bath. The house was completely quiet. For some reason, I decided to look up toward the small bathroom window, and my heart completely dropped. A grown man was pressed against the glass, staring directly down at me. I freaked the hell out. My adrenaline spiked instantly as I scrambled out of the water, threw my robe on, and ran to tell my significant other what just happened. He did not believe me at first. He told me I was probably just imagining things, especially since that specific window was positioned so high up on the wall that no ordinary person could ever reach it from the ground outside. I refused to let it go and forced him to step outside into the dark to inspect the perimeter. When we turned the outside light on, a cold chill ran down my spine. Someone had actively walked over to our equipment shed, which was located a good 500 meters away from the main house. They dragged several heavy wooden pallets all the way back, stacked them up precisely under the bathroom wall, and climbed up just to peep through my window. If this had been some random creep in an easily accessible suburb, it probably would have weirded me out for a few days, and then I would have gotten over it. But the sheer amount of physical labor in planning this individual went through makes me remember him to this very day. It still leaves me with a terrible question. How the hell did he get out there with no vehicle? Did he walk for miles through the scorching desert? Or was he living secretly on our own property inside the thick bush? Cultural note: the Australian outback is one of the most sparsely populated and geographically harsh environments on Earth. Isolated homesteads often feature sprawling layouts where outbuildings and sheds are located hundreds of meters away from the primary residence. Because of the vast distances and the dense, rugged nature of the surrounding bushland, it is entirely possible for transient individuals to camp illegally on massive private properties for weeks at a time, completely undetected by the owners. When I was 14, my family moved to a very isolated area of northern Alberta. We were located about a half-hour straight drive from the nearest tiny town, completely surrounded by dense, quiet wilderness. One night, I was sitting at my computer desk, hanging out on a voice chat server and playing a video game. Our internet connection was always very inconsistent out there, dropping out constantly because of the remote location. I had my headset only halfway on my ears, and my bedroom window wide open to let in some cool air, though the plastic blinds were pulled completely closed. My online friends and I were just joking around when I suddenly heard a sharp rustling noise directly outside the window frame. Still being fairly new to the deep woods, the sound startled me, but I tried to brush it off. I figured it was probably just a deer or some other local animal wandering through the yard, so I continued chatting with my group. Several minutes passed by in silence, and then I heard the exact same scraping sound again. This time, it was positioned directly outside the glass. That made me freeze completely. Normally, wild animals did not stick around the house like that, especially with the bright light seeping out through the plastic and the constant noise coming from my room. My heart started to pound hard against my ribs. I slowly turned my eyes toward the window, which sat barely 2 feet to my left. I looked at the window just in time to see the set of blinds right at my eye level split apart. It looked exactly as if somebody was peeking out from behind a curtain, except the fingers forcing the plastic lines open were on the inside of my screen. On the other side of that tiny gap, 2 enormous wide eyes were staring right back at me from the darkness. They looked massive. I just stared straight into those pupils for what felt like an eternity, too terrified to blink or move a single muscle. Eventually, The sound of the people chattering in my headset snapped me back to reality. I glanced down at my lip monitor for a fraction of a second, and when my eyes darted back to the window, the blinds were completely closed again. There was only a slight crooked crease in the plastic where they had just been forcefully split. I turned my back to the glass, stared fixedly at my computer screen, and forced myself to stay in that exact position for the rest of the night. I was too terrified to even run for the door. I lived in that isolated house for 4 full years, and weird things happened out there many times, but that single encounter always stuck out to me. For the other events, there was always some kind of logical explanation, but to this day, I have no idea how someone managed to get that close without me noticing. Cultural note: Northern Alberta is a vast, heavily forested region in Canada, known for its extreme geography and isolated homesteads. Due to the sparse population density, properties are often surrounded by crown land or thick wilderness, making them vulnerable to transient workers or trespassers who navigate the dark without vehicles. In these remote areas, local law enforcement response times can be severely delayed, forcing rural residents to secure windows and entry points against both wildlife and human intruders who utilize the cover of the woods. I used to spend my summers staying deep inside a massive national park. We had a pretty nice cottage out there, but it was incredibly isolated, with miles of thick forest separating us from the nearest paved road. One night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, I suddenly woke up needing to use the washroom. I slept on the top level of a wooden bunk bed. As I was slowly climbing down the ladder in the dark, something moving outside the glass caught my eye, so I walked over to inspect the property. Down in our front yard, 2 figures were slowly moving through the grass. They were wearing heavy winter parkas, one bright red and one pure white. The white one looked exactly like a women's-style winter coat. They were just casually wandering around our dark front yard, walking in strange, aimless patterns. The night was too dark to make out any distinct faces or physical features, and I could not even tell who they were. The only thing my brain could focus on was the sheer madness of the scene. Why on earth were these people wearing heavy winter parkas in the dead center of a hot summer? A wave of pure panic hit me. I booked it out of my bedroom, sprinted down the hallway, and rushed straight into my parents' room. They did not believe my story at first, figuring it was just a vivid nightmare, but they could see how badly I was shaking, so they let me spend the rest of the night on their floor. This whole situation happened about 7 years ago, but the unsettling memory never truly left me. To this day, I still flat out refuse to sleep anywhere near a bare window, and I can never sleep facing toward one. Cultural note: National parks in the United States and Canada often experience extreme drop-offs in temperature during summer nights, particularly in high altitude or densely forested regions. However, the presence of individuals wearing heavy winter gear during the warmer months can also be linked to transient populations or lost hikers suffering from severe hypothermia, which paradoxically causes confusion and erratic behavior. Isolated cottages within these public lands are highly vulnerable to these nocturnal wanderers who often bypass boundary lines in search of shelter or resources. I live in a teeny village in rural Alaska. There are only about 60 residents here, absolutely no local medical care, and the only real way in or out of this place is by flying on a small chartered airplane. Last winter we hit a stretch of some really rough weather. The temperature dropped down into the -20s and -30s for a pretty long time. That kind of cold is not too crazy for us, but this time it came with a ton of brutal wind and thick ice fog. I work at the local school. One afternoon, right before dismissal, the local village public safety officer showed up out of nowhere. He looked incredibly tense and told me flat out that I needed to keep all the kids inside the building. He also said he needed my husband to gear up immediately, and that I needed to stay glued to the school radio. It turns out, a small airplane had just gone down right outside our village because of the blinding ice fog. They needed every single available person in town, which is why they called my husband to head out into the freeze on four-wheelers and try to locate the crash site. For some strange reason, the emergency responders were not getting any automated beacon signal from the downed plane. However, the injured passengers were still able to manually use their radio equipment. I had to stay completely alone by the school radio, which happened to be the only unit in the entire town receiving their signal, and keep talking to the passengers to keep them conscious. It was freezing, and pitch-black nightfall comes extremely early in the Alaskan winter. Listening to those frightened, hurt voices, static filtering through the speaker, while knowing they were freezing to death out in the dark woods, was completely agonizing. Thankfully, the United States Coast Guard rescue teams managed to reach them a couple of hours after they crashed. The passengers were finally able to connect with the choppers via radio, but it was an incredibly tense, horrible couple of hours. We had recently lost several members of a neighboring village to a fatal aircraft accident, and everyone in our small community was already on edge. This new incident caused a lot of locals to flat out refuse to travel for the rest of the winter. My husband and I actually had to travel for medical reasons right after the crash. Even though I grew up flying in those tiny bush airplanes, that first ride after the accident was rough on my nerves. A couple of months later, I was sitting outside my house, just enjoying the rare sunshine, when I heard a heavy chopping sound. A large helicopter flew right over our village, carrying the crumpled, ruined pieces of what was left of that airplane. It still gives me chills to this day to think about seeing that wreckage dangling in the sky right above us. Cultural note: in rural Alaska, communities are so isolated that they rely entirely on village public safety officers, or VPSOs, who act as the first line of defense before state troopers or the Coast Guard can fly in. During the winter, a phenomenon known as ice fog occurs when water vapor hits extreme sub-zero temperatures, freezing instantly into a thick ground cloud that drops aviation visibility to zero. Because there are no roads, bush pilots are the lifeblood of these villages, making any aviation accident a deeply shared community trauma. My parents owned a small weekend house on a massive 400-acre property in southeast Queensland, Australia. Growing up out there, we always heard terrifying local stories about the yowie being spotted in the area, which absolutely deeply frightened my brother, my mother, and me. At the time of this incident, it was just my brother, my mother, my father, my uncle, and me staying at the isolated property. The woods were pitch black and completely quiet. It was pretty late in the evening, I would say around 10 o'clock, when we suddenly heard a loud, guttural bellow echoing through the trees. It sounded barely 50 meters away from the side of the house. A few moments later, the exact same terrifying noise boomed again, but this time from the completely opposite side of the structure. It felt like whatever was making that sound was moving incredibly fast, circling us in the dark. My dad immediately ran into the house with a look of sheer urgency. He came back out holding 2 rifles, handed one to my uncle, and told us in a serious tone to get inside the building right away. The 3 of us were completely terrified. We were crying and cuddling together on the kitchen floor, listening closely to the heavy silence outside, expecting a confrontation at any second. A few minutes later, the front door opened. My father and my uncle walked into the kitchen, looking at us and laughing loudly. Apparently, they thought it would be a fun prank to scare us, knowing the entire time that the horrific noise was actually just the local koalas. Any person I have told this story to since then always laughs at our reaction, until they actually hear what a koala mating call sounds like in the dead of night. It is truly the most unsettling sound you can imagine. Cultural note. In the isolated bushlands of Queensland, Australia, the mating call of the male koala is notoriously deceptive. Instead of a high-pitched or gentle sound, koalas produce an incredibly deep guttural grunt and a terrifying bellow that closely resembles a roaring predator or a large wild boar. Because these marsupials are nocturnal and human encounters in isolated acreage are rare at night, their loud vocalizations frequently trigger extreme panic among tourists and residents who mistake them for legendary cryptids like the yowie. I grew up on a massive 200-acre ranch. Even though we were technically surrounded by a small town, our property was still fairly isolated in its own way. The very first time I heard the local coyotes howling directly outside my bedroom window, it was super creepy, but it eventually became a regular occurrence during the earlier parts of the year. One evening, I was home alone with just my dad when a strange truck suddenly pulled up. My mom only drove a small car, and our long, winding driveway leading from the main road was about half a mile of rough gravel, so seeing a random vehicle out there was incredibly weird. To make things more interesting, we actually had an old historic train depot sitting abandoned on our property. The mysterious truck pulled up, stopped for a second just at the edge of our immediate driveway, and then suddenly sped off further down the dirt road toward that old depot. We lived way outside the official city limits back then, which meant we would have to call the county sheriff for any kind of help. The sheriff's station was still a good 30+ minutes away from our location, so my dad decided he could not wait around. He grabbed his rifle and headed out into the dark to confront the trespassers himself. Before he could even reach the old building, the truck suddenly sped back down the gravel road toward the main highway and completely took off into the night. This exact same situation happened several times over the next few months. Every single time they visited, the historic depot would be completely trashed and heavily vandalized, but absolutely nothing was ever taken. We never found out who those individuals were, and nobody in our small town owned a truck that looked anything like that one. Cultural note. In rural parts of the United States, large ranches often contain abandoned historical infrastructure, such as old railway stations or manufacturing outbuildings. Because these structures sit miles away from the primary residence and lack modern surveillance, they frequently become prime targets for rural vandals, teenagers, or transient individuals. Due to the extreme distances, local sheriff departments face severe logistical delays, often forcing isolated landowners to handle property security and trespassing confrontations entirely on their own. Like what you see? Subscribe to the Reddit Oracle for more. My grandparents' house sits right on the edge of a small town. There is a regular neighborhood on one side, but on all the other sides, everyone is sitting on an acre or two of dense open land. It makes the property feel isolated, especially after midnight when the streetlights end. One night, when no one else was home, a friend and I were hanging out and smoking cigarettes inside the large enclosed porch. The entire area was wrapped in complete heavy silence. You could only hear the wind passing through the trees. Suddenly, right in the middle of that quietness, we heard a massive, incredibly loud pig squeal. It was right next to us. The sound was so violent and intense that it felt like the animal was trapped inside the enclosed porch with us, right in the dark corner. Sure, some of the rural neighbors around there keep horses and chickens, but as far as I knew, nobody owned any pigs. The worst part was the quality of the noise itself. It did not quite sound like a real animal. It sounded exactly like a grown man mimicking a pig noise with a desperate, strained throat. The most terrifying thing about the entire situation was how displaced the volume was. I mean, even if a next-door neighbor actually owned a livestock animal, Their property line was far enough away that the sound should have been a lot quieter and muffled by the distance. This was sharp, clear, and uncomfortably close. The sheer shock hit us instantly. We did not wait around to investigate the dark yard. We bolted inside the main house and locked the heavy door immediately. Lots of other strange, unsettling things happened in that house over the years. I remember light switches flipping off by themselves while I was completely alone in a room, followed by cold drafts. That place still gives me the chills whenever the sun goes down. Cultural note: in many semi-rural borderlands across the United States, properties transition rapidly from suburban lots to large agricultural acreage. These poorly lit transitional zones often suffer from trespassing by vagrants or individuals engaging in drug-related activities. Criminals or trespassers hiding in the dark brush frequently utilize animal mimics, such as bird calls, coyote yips, or livestock distress sounds to communicate with partners or to deliberately startle homeowners into fleeing inside, allowing the intruders to test property security without revealing their human presence. I have two memories from my childhood that still keep me up at night. I posted this first one on another thread before, but it fits this topic perfectly. When I was much younger, around 5 years old, my family and I lived in a massive house located deep in the dense woods. My bedroom was positioned on the first floor, and it featured a window that was about 15 feet wide and 6 feet tall. It was a huge, imposing piece of glass. Because it was so oddly large, my parents could never find any curtains or blinds that properly fit the frame. I just had a bare, completely exposed window. At the time, we thought it was fine because, like I said, we were completely isolated in the middle of the woods with no neighbors around. One night, I woke up in the dead of winter with that heavy, freezing feeling of being watched. I slowly opened my eyes, looked toward the glass, and froze. A grown man wearing all black was standing right outside my window, just staring down at me in the dark. I screamed at the top of my lungs. The moment the sound left my mouth, the figure turned around and ran off fast, disappearing into the dark trees. I also just remembered another incident that happened while living in that exact same house. I am going to change some of the specific details of the case for privacy reasons, but the core of it remains true. A woman suddenly went missing while out shopping about 20 miles away from our home. A few days later, local law enforcement found her abandoned car parked inside a state park right near our property line. Naturally, the search team swarmed the area to look for any clues. During the investigation, they found the missing woman's cell phone sitting in the brush, only about 100 feet away from our house. It has been about 12 years now since that dark afternoon, and she still has not been found. Cultural note: the vast state parks and dense woodlands across rural America often present massive logistical challenges for search and rescue operations during missing person cases. When personal items like cell phones are recovered within close proximity to isolated residential structures, it often indicates that the perpetrator utilized the private property's boundary lines and dark terrain to avoid detection or to quickly discard evidence before fleeing deep into the surrounding wilderness. My mum's friend bought an abandoned Victorian primary school in rural South Wales last December. She was so incredibly excited when she finally picked up the keys that she insisted we go and camp inside the property for the very first night. The building sits in a fairly secluded area, right on top of a lonely hill. It is nowhere near a local pub or a town center, so you never get any random passers-by up there. It was completely isolated after dark. She brought her 5 dogs along, and we had our 3. But as soon as we pulled up and stepped out of the vehicle, one of our bull terriers darted straight back down the long drive in pure panic. I chased after him immediately, running through the cold air. As soon as he got outside the main gate, he turned around and started growling. barking aggressively and then whimpering while facing the dark school structure. None of our dogs have ever done anything like this before. I wanted to nope out of there right then, but I decided to man up instead. I managed to coerce him back up the drive and inside the cold building. But the unsettling behavior did not stop. All throughout the night, the dogs would randomly walk over to completely empty parts of the school, stare into the dark corners, and start barking frantically at nothing. It was creepy as fuck staying inside an abandoned school in the middle of nowhere. Cultural note: Victorian primary schools in rural Wales were often built as sturdy stone structures designed to serve small, isolated valleys. When these historic buildings become abandoned, they are frequently left empty for decades due to strict heritage preservation laws and the high cost of renovation. The sudden introduction of domestic animals into these long, vacant, poorly insulated spaces often triggers intense behavioral reactions, as their acute senses pick up on the nesting sounds of local wildlife, bats, or shifting foundations muffled by the thick stone walls. Before I bought my current house, which is still pretty far out in the middle of nowhere, my son and I lived in this old place on 50 acres of private land. To make things even more intense, we were completely surrounded by an 850-acre state park. It was ultra secluded. You could not see another house or street light for miles. One night, after finally putting my son to bed, the quietness of the woods took over, and I dozed off in my rocking chair. The whole house was pitch black, except for a small light in the hallway. Suddenly, a heavy, violent thud woke me right up. Someone was actively trying to bust through my back door. My heart was racing instantly, pounding hard against my ribs. I stood up, freezing for a second as the wooden floors groaned. My first instinct was my kid, so I crept into his room to ensure he was completely fine and fast asleep. Once I knew he was safe, I ran over to the safe and grabbed my weapon. Yes, I keep one around strictly for home defense, especially when you live out in the deep woods where emergency services take forever to arrive. I crept toward the kitchen, where the back door is located. Every single shadow looked like a threat. I was incredibly nervous, terrified, and totally running on pure adrenaline. The loud scraping noise didn't stop. It still sounded exactly like a person trying to break down the frame. I reached for the switch, flipped on the outside porch light, and jumped right in front of the window with my weapon raised and poised to fire. I braced myself for a confrontation, but when my eyes adjusted to the bright light, I froze. Clinging directly to my screen door were two absolutely humongous raccoons. They were stretched out on the metal mesh, looking massive in the dark. We literally just stood there, staring right at each other through the glass. My hands were still shaking from the shock. That is when the pieces came together. I had been slow roasting a pork shoulder in my oven, letting it cook overnight. The rich, savory smell had drifted through the vents and out into the yard. These two massive guys smelled it from the woods and decided to investigate the source. The adrenaline suddenly washed away, leaving me completely exhausted. I actually let out an audible, "Dudes, you scared the shit out of me!" The funniest part is that as soon as I spoke, they slowly climbed down off the screen door. They turned around and just walked away into the darkness, looking back at me as if they actually felt ashamed for giving me the fright of my life. Cultural note: in the rural United States, living adjacent to state parks or massive conservation lands often creates intense human-wildlife interactions. Raccoons in these isolated environments can grow exceptionally large, sometimes reaching over 30 pounds. Their highly developed paws allow them to manipulate doorknobs, latches, and screens, which frequently causes isolated homeowners to mistake their aggressive foraging habits for a literal home invasion. When I was around 12 years old, my family lived in a tiny, remote place in the backwoods right on the borderline between Arkansas and Oklahoma. One weekend, I had a close friend staying the night over at my place. The next morning, my entire family was planning to drive out to a big amusement park for the day, and she was coming along with us. Just for fun, my dad decided to set up our camping trailer in the yard for us to spend the night inside. He even went through the trouble of hooking it up to the water lines and electricity, so we would not have to keep running in and out of the main house all night to use the bathroom, or rely on old lanterns and flashlights. To ensure we did not keep my parents awake if we were being too noisy, he parked the trailer on the far side of his workshop. I had slept outside in the yard many times before, so the remote setup did not bother me at all. My sister ended up staying in the camper with us for a while, but eventually, my friend and I made her angry, and she decided she was going to head back inside the main house. When she turned the handle and tried to open the door, the metal frame only swung open partway before it slammed shut extremely hard from the outside. We immediately figured my dad or my brother were just lurking out there in the dark trying to scare us, but nothing else happened for a while. Hours later, when we finally decided it was time to go to sleep, we drew straws to pick our spots. I drew the short straw, which meant I got the table bed right by the side window. My sister got the couch that folded out into a bed, and my friend claimed the top bunk. The moment I stepped over to get into my designated bed, my body went completely numb. I could distinctly hear something massive breathing directly outside the camper window. The sound was coming from the very top edge of the high window frame, and somehow, deep down in my chest, I just knew it was not human. As I turned around and started rushing back across the camper floor, telling the girls that I was absolutely not sleeping over there, the entire structure began to violently rock back and forth. I do not mean like a regular black bear leaning its weight against the siding or pushing on the metal. I mean the heavy frame was violently shoved one way and then forcefully pulled back the other. It was basically rolling back and forth on its heavy wheels. Mind you, this was a massive 24-foot travel trailer. The intense shaking lasted for quite some time. None of us can remember exactly how it happened, but in the middle of the chaos, we all ended up huddled together in one single corner of the top bunk. When the violent rolling finally stopped, the silence did not last. We could hear heavy, aggressive stomping all around the outside walls, and any time the presence moved near a window, that awful, heavy, beastly breathing would start all over again. The next morning, my dad was incredibly angry, to say the least. When he walked out to the shop, he found that the massive travel trailer had been completely ripped loose from the electric lines and water hookups. Even worse, the entire 24-foot structure had been physically moved several yards away from where it was originally parked. My dad blamed me at first, and I thought I was never going to do enough chores to pay off the heavy damage. All we have in this specific county are small black bears. Even standing up on their hind legs, they would not have been tall enough to reach the height where I heard that deep breathing. My dad eventually realized that not even a massive bear could have dragged that heavy trailer back and forth across the dirt like that. Cultural note: the border region between Arkansas and Oklahoma, heavily defined by the Ouachita Ozark mountain ranges, is famous for its dense ancient backwoods and extreme isolation. Local folklore across these rural counties has long documented unexplained encounters with unclassified apex predators or large bipedal creatures. Because these heavily wooded properties span hundreds of acres with no neighbors or light pollution, the absolute darkness often masks large territorial wildlife whose sheer physical strength can easily manipulate heavy agricultural equipment and unsecured vehicles. When I was young, my grandmother lived in a very rural, isolated part of Ireland. Because of the vast distance from any town, my brother and I were sent to visit her for a couple of weeks every single summer to experience the countryside. Frequently, my grandmother would send us out on foot to do little chores for her. We would bring fresh bread or homemade jam to the distant neighbors, or head out into the fields to collect turf for the evening fire. One summer afternoon, she handed me a fresh loaf of bread and sent me on a delivery to a house located about 3 or 4 miles away. The narrow dirt laneway leading to the property was completely enclosed by thick, overgrown hedges that blocked most of the natural light. As I was walking down that lonely path, the heavy silence of the fields was broken. I became intensely aware of a grown man standing deep within the thick hedges. He was watching my every move. He began walking parallel to me, tracking my steps from inside the dense brush. I was extremely frightened. My heart started pounding against my chest, and I immediately ran the rest of the way down the lane without looking back. I think the woman of the house knew right away that something had terrified me the moment I arrived on her porch. She was incredibly kind. She made me warm tea and sandwiches using my grandmother's bread, and she let me stay inside to play with her dogs. She kept me safe there until her eldest son finally got back from work, so he could drive me back to my grandmother's house in his vehicle. I am still so thankful for her quick thinking. To this day, I still do not know who that individual was watching and following me through the isolated fields, or how long they had been tracking my movements before I finally noticed them. Cultural note: in rural Ireland, traditional boreens narrow, ancient country lanes are commonly lined with mature, dense hedgerows consisting of blackthorn and hawthorn bushes. These hedges can grow several feet thick and over 10 feet high, creating completely blind corridors with zero visibility into the adjacent fields. Because these isolated agricultural areas have very low population densities, traversing these lanes alone, especially during the 20th century, left children highly vulnerable to transient individuals or trespassers utilizing the thick foliage for concealment. Finally, I can contribute to this. It is not so much horrifying as it is deeply disturbing. There is a small town on the peninsula of Washington state called Westport. It is located about 30 minutes away from the nearest actual town. During the warmer months, it is pretty much just a touristy summer spot with a lot of commercial fishing and a small harbor. Last December, my friend suggested we go camping at the state park right on this beach. His family visited every single summer. We were all totally up for a winter adventure. So all 7 of us decided to pitch in a few dollars to rent a small cabin near the ocean at Twin Harbors State Park. When we finally arrived, the entire place was dead. It was not a situation where there were just a few people around. There were literally 0 people and 0 cars in the town, and the entire campsite was empty, other than one lone sheriff patrolling the area. There was not even any normal traffic on the road outside of our group. When we reached our cabin, we found the campsite completely flooded. Winters on the Washington State Peninsula are literally just 4 continuous months of freezing rain, so we could not walk anywhere. All of the park benches and wooden chairs were stacked up on top of each other, and there was only one public bathroom open. We were essentially stranded in our cabin, unless we wanted to drive somewhere, but we made do, and decided to head into town. We drove into the empty town, got some lunch at a small fish and chip shop, and went to visit the local lighthouse. That is when we finally saw another human being. It was one ragged-looking guy who was soaking wet, walking down the empty road all by himself. We could actually smell him from 20 feet away. He was limping really badly and talking loudly to himself. All of a sudden, he yelled, face planted full force onto the hard ground, and started rolling around in the middle of the road like he was going through an actual exorcism. We immediately called the law enforcement line and quickly got the hell out of there. When we got back to the park, we had dinner, hung out, and listened to music together for a while. At around 8 in the evening, a shitty rusted-out beater car screeched down the road we were staying on. The driver parked really sloppily right in front of the public restrooms. The car stayed there for about 45 minutes before it finally left. Later that night, my friend Sheffy and I decided to take a quick shower before going to bed. As we walked toward the public facility, a woman in her mid-30s wearing a short cheetah print skirt and a leather vest was just sitting alone on the bench outside of the showers. Being clueless, I asked her how the showers work since I had never been there before, assuming she was just camping somewhere else in the park. She just smirks, looks directly at my friend and me, and says, "Sorry, honey, I only deal in foreign currency." That is when the realization hit me. This woman was definitely not there for a regular camping trip. We just ignored her, stepped inside, and quickly bathed ourselves. When I stepped out, I saw the woman getting uncomfortably close to my other friend who had just finished as well. I told her flat out to leave us alone. We started walking back to our dark cabin, and who else but the exact same junk car from earlier drives past us. He pulls into his old spot again, starts arguing loudly with the woman, and yells at us to leave them alone. We got back inside with our group and watched them from a distance. He argued with her for a while, then she finally got into his car, and they drove off. We relaxed for the rest of the night, figuring it was just some random individuals trying to handle their illegal business in an isolated spot. Eventually, everyone went to bed except for Connor and me. We were casually talking about random stuff around 3:30 in the morning, when all of a sudden, we heard the heavy sound of multiple vehicles driving by. 3 massive trucks, and the exact same fucking beater car again. A bunch of rough-looking guys hopped out of the trucks holding heavy flashlights. They immediately started approaching the isolated cabins, shining their lights directly into the windows and aggressively fidgeting with the window frames to see if they were unlocked. By the time we realized what they were actually doing, they were already moving on to the second cabin. Connor and I both started waking everyone up fast, telling them the exact situation we had on our hands. Everyone was confused and disoriented. We forced them awake and turned every single light in our cabin on. The guys outside noticed the lights instantly. They stopped when they saw we had 7 people inside, and it helped that most of my friends had grabbed our wood-chopping axes. The men quickly walked back to their trucks and started talking to the rest of their friends in the bathroom parking lot, pointing directly at our cabin and watching us the entire time. We packed our things as fast as we humanly could into our vehicles and drove away. We had to drive right past them to leave the campground. As soon as we passed, they pulled out right behind us and followed our cars from the state park all the way to the highway before they promptly turned around. We called the campsite sheriff multiple times during the chase, but he never picked up the phone. I have no idea what their actual plan was, but we were not going to stay there a second longer. We were scared, absolutely witless. It felt like being trapped inside a horror movie. I do not get scared easily, but I still get anxious thinking about what would have happened to us if we had stayed asleep. Cultural note: state parks in the Pacific Northwest, particularly along the isolated Olympic Peninsula of Washington, become nearly deserted during the winter months due to relentless rainfall. This extreme seasonal vacancy often turns these public lands into temporary havens for illicit activities, unauthorized trade, and local vagrants. Because these parks span hundreds of acres of dense forest with minimal winter staffing, emergency response is virtually non-existent, leaving off-season campers entirely isolated and vulnerable to local criminal elements who utilize the empty grounds as private territory. The absolute scariest moment happened when I was only 10 years old. I woke up in the middle of the night because my dog would not stop barking like crazy out in the yard. I went downstairs, opened the front door, and came face to face with an enormous black bear. My adrenaline took over, and I ended up chasing it off into the dark while aggressively clanging metal pots and pans together. I got into a massive amount of trouble with my parents for doing something so incredibly dangerous. But the creepiest thing happened when I was about 13. To give you a picture of how rural my upbringing was, I grew up in the lonely foothills of the Sierra Nevadas. We lived 10 miles outside of a tiny town that did not even have a single traffic stoplight. It was just dense trees and mountains. One afternoon, while I was exploring the deep woods behind our property, I stumbled upon a pillowcase hidden in the brush. Inside, there was a small jewelry box, a bunch of cheap kids' rings and necklaces, a couple of keychains, and a school identification card for a girl in the 4th grade. There were also a few other little girl things packed away in there. I did not think much of it at the exact moment, assuming someone had just dropped it. But a couple of days later, I went back out into the woods to retrieve the bag, and the entire thing was completely gone. To this day, I still wish I could remember that girl's name or even the specific school on the identification card. I still get a terrible feeling that something awful happened out there in those woods. By the way, if you want to talk about raw terror, the scariest sound I have ever heard in my life is a mountain lion's scream out in the dark. It sounds exactly like a woman in agony. You can never, ever get used to that sound. Cultural note: the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California contain vast tracts of heavily wooded, rugged terrain where isolated properties border public wilderness. Due to the extreme lack of foot traffic and surveillance, these rural forests are unfortunately known to be used by criminals to hide stolen property or evidence. Additionally, these regions are prime habitats for apex predators like mountain lions, whose piercing, human-like territorial screams frequently cause severe psychological distress to isolated residents. If you like these stories, make sure to subscribe to the Reddit Oracle.